Hey Cake Chums, and welcome back to the Mr. Baker's Cakes Kitchen and part 2 of my how to create a realistic woolly hat cake tutorial. In case you missed it last week, I showed you how to bake a traditional British Christmas cake in a Pyrex pudding basin so that you would have a cake in the correct shape for making my woolly hat cake. So in this week's video, I'm going to show you now how to take that baked cake, which is currently hiding amongst all this tin foil, cover it in marzipan and then decorate it to look like a traditional woolly hat. I know lots of you are particularly keen to find out how I create my realistic looking fluffy bobbles or pom-poms, so I guess without much further ado, we better get to the video. Now before we get started, there are a couple of things that you are going to need to be able to take part in this tutorial. Number one, of course, is a cake shaped like a woolly hat. And as I've already mentioned last week, I showed you how to bake a fruit cake in a Pyrex bowl to give you that shape. You could, of course, just bake a normal layered cake and carve that down to shape as well. And I've even done them where I've used the same Pyrex dishes to mold Rice Krispie treats too when I'm using it as a top on a larger cake, such as this one. Once you have your cake, you will of course also need some marzipan, and I will be using Renshaw's original marzipan in white. You can of course make your own marzipan, and I will be doing a live video later today, in fact, over in the Yellow Bee Sugar Craft group. I can never remember what it's called. But the next episode of the Beginner's Cake School is going up later today, live, and I will be showing you how to make marzipan. So if you fancy learning how to do that, head down to the video description and I will post a link there for you. But that aside, as I say, today we're going to be using the Renshaw marzipan. And then to cover our cake, we're going to be using Renshaw Extra Ready to Roll icing. And I would recommend you do use a more premium brand of icing, so the Renshaw Extra or something with equal kind of stretch and strength to it, simply because we will be using molds to make the wool textures for the main part of our hat, and softer pastes such as supermarket pastes or kind of lower quality ones. I don't want to be controversial. Anyway, they do tend to sometimes get stuck in those molds. And that leads me very nicely on to the final kind of key thing that you will need to make your woolly hat cake today, and that is a selection of knit effect molds. I have these ones from Karen Davies Sugarcraft, and I'll post links to the individual ones I have here down in the video description as well. In particular, we will be using these two, and much as I would love to say that I remember what they're actually called, I'm not sure that I can. This one I know is the chunky knit mold, and we'll be using this for the main body of the hat. This one might be the cable knit mold. Let me check. No, I'm absolutely lying to you. That's the cable knit. This is the chunky rib mold. So we've got the chunky knit mold and the chunky rib mold. And as I say, I'll post links to both of those down in the video description. And I lied, actually the one other thing that you are going to need is a small daisy plunger cutter. All will become clear. But anyway, as I say, we don't have time to waste, so I'm going to get reorganised here and let's get cracking on making our realistic woolly hat cakes. Really need to think of a shorter name for this tutorial. Okay, so as I say, the first thing we're going to need to do today is prepare our cake for marzipaning. Now, I have fed my cake a couple of times this week since we made them last week, but ideally you'd want to make this a little further in advance, just so that you have time to give a jolly good feed with your choice of booze before you decorate it. But it still smells absolutely amazing. Now, the traditional way to stick your marzipan to your Christmas cake is to use apricot jam, and that's what I have just brushed this one here with. And I've also placed mine on a cake drum just because I want it to be mobile so that if I want to put it on top of another cake, I can do that. It's also going to give it a little bit of extra height just because I want my woolly hat to be a little bit taller. Now you can see if you look closely here that my cake drum is marginally smaller than the cake itself. So what I'm going to do is use some marzipan to just fill that gap there before I cover the cake. And actually it's a really good habit to get into, to just use your marzipan to spot kind of any holes or dips like this one over here and just plug those up as well. And if you're unfamiliar with the term marzipan, it may well be that you know this as almond paste. It's essentially just a kind of icing that is made predominantly from almonds. So I'm just going to take some little bits of marzipan and just use them to kind of fill any little holes that perhaps our greaseproof paper left in the cake last week, or sometimes they can be there just because of the way that your cake mixture filled your pan. What we're aiming for is a completely smooth surface so that when we cover the cake with marzipan in a moment, we won't have any lumps, bumps or ridges showing through. Now that's very much the quick version of that. Obviously you can spend a little bit longer on yours just to make sure you're completely happy that you've got that completely smooth surface. And then as I say, the next thing I'm going to do is just wrap kind of a sausage of the marzipan around the base of the cake so that that cake drum is blended into the surface of the cake as well. If you found that your cake has domed in the middle when you've made it as well, and it's not lying completely flat, you can also use some extra marzipan as well just to kind of flatten off what was the top and is now the bottom of your cake, just to make sure it's nice and even. Hopefully you can see that I have just rolled a sausage of that marzipan and I'm just wrapping it around the base of the cake. And then I'm just going to push it into place with my fingers just to give me that nice, even surface. Once you've done that, you should have something that looks vaguely like this. And then we can just pop that aside, ready to roll out the rest of our marzipan. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you probably know that I like to use corn flour to dust my work surfaces when I'm working with sugar paste or fondant or ready to roll icing, whatever you want to call it. But don't use corn flour or cornstarch when you are working with marzipan or almond paste, because it can cause the almond paste to ferment and actually make your cake go off. And obviously we don't want that to happen, particularly with a Christmas cake that usually has an incredibly long shelf life. So when I'm working on Christmas cakes in particular, I use icing sugar to dust my work surface, and that's what we're going to be using today. So instead of my little corn flour dusting pouch, I've got one of these little shakers full of icing sugar, and that's what I'm going to use to roll out my marzipan. Now, as to how thick you take your marzipan, that's really up to you. I love marzipan and would quite happily eat this on its own, so I do like quite a thick layer of marzipan on my Christmas cake. If you're not so keen, you can of course leave it out entirely and just do a double thick layer of icing, or you might just decide to take it a little bit thinner. When you're happy with the thickness of your marzipan, it's simply a case of covering your cake just like you would with ready to roll icing. So just laying that over the top and then gradually helping it work its way down the sides. Now this is a lovely and easy shape to cover because we've got no square edges to worry about, anything like that. So you don't need to panic about getting it nice and flat and smooth on the sides. It's just about covering the whole thing and making sure there's no lumps or bumps showing through anymore. You can then trim away the excess in line with the edge of the cake. And the rest of your marzipan can be put into a plastic food safe bag to keep it soft until you're ready to use it on another of your Christmas cakes. Alternatively, you could also just eat it, or even use it for modelling. Little marzipan cake toppers look adorable and they taste absolutely delicious too. The last thing we're going to do with our marzipan covered cake is just use a fondant smoother to go around the edge and just neaten up that base, pushing those bottom edges into that band that we wrapped around the cake earlier on. And that's very much the base for our woolly hats. We can set this aside now, have a bit of a clean up, and then we'll go through how to decorate the cake itself. So when it comes to decorating our cakes, as I mentioned in the introduction, we're going to be using the range of knit effect molds from Karen Davey Sugarcraft. For the main body of the hat, we're going to be using the chunky knit mold, which looks like this. And you can see it's got a very traditional knitting effect pattern on it. In fact, you might not be able to see that still, but conveniently, I have a piece of icing that I have already had a practice run on. So you can see there, you've got all the individual stitches and everything running through it. Now, I must confess, I am no expert at working with molds, and I can only show you how I use my Karen Davies Sugarcraft molds. So if Karen ends up watching this and I'm doing it incredibly wrong, maybe just don't tell me, Karen, just let me carry on making my mistakes. But to use them, what I like to do is give them a jolly good dusting of either icing sugar or corn flour, depending on what I'm working with. Remember, we're working with icing sugar today because it will be touching that marzipan. And then I take a piece of icing that I think is roughly the right size to fill the mold, and I kind of hand shape it into a bit of a rectangle. Now that rectangle will be smaller than the mold, and I'll place it in at one end. Now that one end, I'm going to use my fingers to kind of push it down into place in line with the edge of the mold. And then, using my rolling pin, I'm going to roll away from me, pushing that icing into the mold as it goes. And one of the reasons why I'm only pushing in one direction is because if I start rolling backwards and forwards, that paste will actually move around inside the mold and it would distort that impression. I obviously want it to be as neat as it can be so that I get a really realistic looking knit effect. Now, because these are silicone molds, you'll find that they do move around slightly, so you can really kind of push down nice and hard, and that icing will continue to stretch its way down until hopefully it fills up the entire length of the mold, like this. I'm then just going to neaten up those corners with my fingers again. And then, to remove any excess, I'm going to take a large kitchen knife and cut from the centre of the mold out towards the edge, dragging that blade across the edge of the mold. Now again, this silicone will not get cut by a knife, it's nice and strong, so you should find that you're able to then neaten up the edge of the mold much more than you had just by rolling. Do that same thing across all four sides of the mold, and if you find that the knife is dragging, make sure to give the blade a wipe off with just some dry kitchen roll. What we want to do is just end up with a nice flat piece of icing like this, and then again we can just go in with our fingers, dragging any frayed bits back towards the centre to neaten up those edges. Once you're happy with how it's looking, we're just going to brush some more of that icing sugar across the work surface, flip the mould over so that the icing is lying on its back, and then very carefully and slowly tease that mould up, leaving the icing flat on the work surface. And hopefully you should end up with a lovely, neat, realistic looking piece of icing that looks like it's been knitted. Now you'll need about 3 of these to go around the circumference of your cake. But of course, if you've gone bigger or smaller, you may find you need more or less. You'll also find that if I lay this against the cake, it doesn't reach quite to the top or to the bottom. Now the bottom is going to be hidden by the fold of wool that will be up there. So we really want to focus our attention on this top bit here. The other tricky part is of course the fact that the cake is curved, so it's not going to be a case, I'm afraid, of simply just folding it over at the top. The first thing I'm going to do is brush my marzipan here with some cooled boiled water. That's what's going to make it nice and sticky and help our sugar paste stick to it. And you do want to make sure that that water has covered the entire surface of the cake, just to make sure that we don't end up with any dry patches. Next, I'm just going to take a piece of clean kitchen roll and just run that around the cake board, because I want the icing to stick to the cake, but not the board. And then it's time to take a piece of our icing, and I'm going to kind of lay it around the cake, trying to keep it at an even height all the way around, if that makes sense. So this is probably, I'd say, about 4 centimeters from the bottom of the cake. And then what I'm going to do is kind of gather it in towards the top, almost like that knitting is getting a bit finer. I hope that kind of makes sense to everyone. Now this bit is probably the trickiest part of the whole make, and it is impossible to get it looking perfect. But if we can get the majority of this bunching on the top, we can hide it with our bobble or our pom pom. So it's kind of just about pulling it together and trying not, of course, to ruin too much of that knit effect. When you've done that with one piece, you're then just going to continue your way around the cake until the entire thing is covered. Do make sure that you put your knit effect the same way up all the way around, otherwise it will look really strange. And then you can see I've just got a tiny little gap over here, so I try and bring that up again, leaving myself a little space. I'm just going to take maybe 3 more links off another piece of moulded icing. 1, 2, 3, and then I can slide that into that space, gathering all of that icing together at the top. But now if I hold that out for you there, you can hopefully see that we basically have our knit going all the way around the cake and then kind of gathering into these lumps here at the top. One of the great things about these moulds by Karen Davies is not only can you see that they end on a straight line so that you can bump them up together, but you can also match them up underneath as well. So if I trim this down slightly, about here, you should see that I can just bump this in underneath, matching up that zigzag pattern with the one above, giving me a continuation of the same pattern. Bump it in, and again, don't forget, most of this will be hidden by that flap or that fold up anyway. But you can also then take some time to just go in with your modelling tool, really just kind of finesse those joins and hide them away just by going over the knit impression that you've used and blending those seams together. Now you've probably noticed that the cake at this stage is covered in icing sugar, but don't panic, because what you can now do is just grab a large, clean, fluffy brush and just use that to dust off any excess icing sugar that there may be. Now, of course, if you have a cake steamer like this one here, then you can also use this, and what this will do is just kind of melt away any of those imperfections or those patches of icing sugar, and it will also have the added benefit of making our cake nice and wet and sticky, ready to add on the next layers of knit effect icing. So I'm now going to switch from the chunky knit mould to the chunky rib mould, and this is going to be the one that I'm going to use to do that folded over brim around the bottom of my hat. Now, of course, you could use the same mould again if you only have one, or you don't want to go out and buy loads of them all in one go. Similarly, you could also do the whole hat using the chunky rib mould, and I have done that before as well. To use a chunky rib mould, we're going to work in exactly the same way. And then for this one, because we're doing it around the bottom of the cake there, we can literally just take our knife in half. And then this can be wrapped around the base of the cake to create that brim. And hopefully it should hide that unsightly join where I put the second piece of paste under the first one. So that's what I mean. Working with these molds is so forgiving because you have so many textures that you can hide imperfections behind. And that's one of the reasons why I was so unconcerned about the fact that I hadn't done a very good job of joining up those pastes, because I knew that this next layer would be perfect hiding that imperfection. So just pushing them together at the seam, and hopefully you can see that our hat is already taking shape. Now you can see that those two pieces took me about 3/4 of the way around, so I'm just going to mould one final piece of that chunky rib effect, and then it will be time for the bit that I know a lot of you are waiting for, the pom-pom. And then once you've got to this stage, you have essentially finished the main part of your hat. Now don't forget, as I say, I'm doing it in this bright pink colour, mainly so that you guys can see it really easily on camera. But these look absolutely brilliant if you do one style, or one colour, I should say, on the main body of the hat up here, and then another colour around the bottom on this brim. And if I remember, I'll pop a picture up of a cake that I actually used that dual colour effect on. And then we're just going to brush off the excess icing sugar, and again, if you have a steamer, you can use your steamer just to remove that as well. I have to say, if you don't have a steamer, I do highly recommend them. I use it on all of my cakes because, as well as removing any excess icing sugar or corn flour, it's also great for removing kind of watermarks from where you've been gluing, any fingerprints or imperfections like that. But now I'm going to set this aside, have another tidy up, and we'll talk how to make a pom-pom. Okay, and so I've had a bit of a tidy up, and you can probably see I've adjusted the filming angle as well, because I'm going to warn you now, the pom-pom takes quite a while. You might want to leave yourselves plenty of time for this bit. And what I've also done while the camera's been off is just added a couple of little kind of mini pom-poms here on the front of my hat, just to hide that seam. Now those are part of the cable knit mould set from Karen Davies. So if you do fancy picking up all three, then you'll be able to do that as well. But of course you could just take a little longer to blend that seam together. We're going to pop the cake back to the side again, and I'm going to show you how to make the pom-pom. Now I tend to make my pom-poms out of Rice Krispie treats, but of course you could also use cake pop mix if you'd prefer. And one of the great things about making your pom-poms separately using either Rice Krispie treats or cake pop mix is that you can make them as big or as small as you want. Now because we only need a tiny amount of rice cereal treat today, I'm going to use ready-made ones from the supermarket. But of course you can make your own as well, and I do have a video right here on my channel on how to make rice cereal treat mixture. I'll link it up in the corner. That corner? That corner. Why can I never remember the corner? It's that corner. It is. That corner. Now I'm going to go with 3 of these ready-made rice cereal treat bars today for my pom-pom, but as I say, you can make it bigger if you want to. Once you've seen the work involved, you may well want to make it smaller. Now these are pretty sticky, just like real rice cereal treat mixture, so you should be able to just find that you can push them together, and then you want to essentially roll them into a ball. And you should hopefully end up with something that looks like this. Pop that aside and have a bit of a clean up again, because we're going to be rolling out icing in just a moment, and we don't want to be scooping up all of those crumbs from the rice cereal treat mixture into our icing. Next, take some more of that pink icing that we've been working with all along. Dust your work surface again with your icing sugar, and then roll it out so it's large enough to cover the ball of rice cereal mixture that we've just made. Next, we're going to brush some water onto the surface of the icing that we've just rolled out. Place that ball of rice cereal mixture on top, and then start to bring it up to cover that ball, gathering the icing in one corner. Trim off the excess with your knife, and then what I like to do, dust my hands with plenty of icing sugar, or again you can use corn flour if you're not working with marzipan, and just roll that ball between your hands to smooth any seams and get it as round as possible. Once you've done that, bring your cake back in, and this literally just gets squished onto the top like that. Now of course we're not done yet, because essentially all we have done is put a ball on top of our hat. Now we need to add the pom-pom texture, and I'll warn you, this is the bit that takes the longest. So with even more of our pink icing, we're going to roll it out, this time nice and thin. Okay, I've switched to working on a non-stick board because you don't even want to imagine the noise that it was making using the plunger cutter on the worktop. But now we are switching to that small daisy plunger cutter, and we're going to start cutting out lots of little daisies. And then once you have a few of those, you can start adding them to your pom-pom. Now to attach them, you can either use water as your edible glue, or you might decide you'd prefer to use piping gel. I like to use piping gel because I find it's quite sticky, obviously, because it's piping gel. I prefer piping gel because it means that those bobble bits, once they're on there, they're not coming off. Whereas obviously with water, they do have a tendency to still move around. So I'm just going to brush some piping gel onto one area of that bobble, and then using a small ball tool, I'm going to start picking up these small daisies and pushing them onto that bobble. Now when you push in, what's going to happen is the petals of that flower are going to squeeze over around the tool, and that's how you're going to end up with them all sticking outwards. So hopefully if I do that right at the front here, so you can see, when I push in, those bits fold over, and that gives me that texture that I'm looking for. And while it might not look like much at the moment, as we keep going, you'll find that it will start to build up and really give you that realistic bobble texture that we're after. Make sure to push them nice and close together, because otherwise it won't look like continuous texture, it will just look like little flowers stuck to a ball. So I'm almost, once I've got it on the ball tool, I go next to the previous one, drag it into it slightly, and then push down. And then what you'll find will happen is as you add them above, it will close up the holes in the centre as well. Now as you can probably tell, I'm going to be here for quite some time doing this. So rather than make you watch that, I think we'll jump ahead to when I've nearly finished, and hopefully you'll be able to see the full effect. See you in a bit. So I've now been at this for coming up 2 hours, I would say, and we are getting there. If I hold this out slightly more towards you guys, you can see we're almost at the top. So I'm going to keep going, and then I'll check in back with you guys when this is done. Woo! And there we go guys, after I think it literally was 2 hours of pom-pom-age or bobble-age, whatever your preferred term is, there is our realistic woolly hat Christmas cake. There are 1 or 2 finishing touches I would recommend you do just before you kind of wrap things up. First of all, sometimes these individual kind of fluffy bits, or the daisies I guess, don't always stick super well. So very gently, once they've had a chance to firm up, if you just kind of give everything a little squeeze, that would just make sure everything's like completely bonded together. And then once I've done that, I do like to just grab my steamer one more time and give the whole thing a really good steam, just because again, that steam will get right into that bobble and really help everything just stick together. Of course, once you're at this stage as well, you can also then decide if you want to add some shading and accents. You could use some edible dust powder colours to add just a slightly darker shade of pink anywhere where there's a seam or where you would naturally expect shadow to be. So obviously here under the base of the pom-pom, around the top of this, did we ever establish what that was called? And around where I've added these extra mini pom-poms on the front as well. Those are all places that you would expect to find shading in a real hat, so you could add some there. I'm not going to do it today simply because this is still a little bit wet from where I did that steam earlier on, and if I try to put powder on it at the moment, it's just going to stick like glue to that water, and therefore it won't like shade naturally. I might add some later on and whack a photo up on my social media, so if you're not already following me on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, you can find all my social media links down in the video description, but I'm essentially at Mr. Baker's Cakes on all of them. But yeah, anyway, I do hope you enjoyed finding out how to make my realistic woolly hat Christmas cake, and that the length of time it takes to create this big fluffy pom-pom doesn't put you off having a go yourself. One thing I will say is that I demonstrated this cake at Cake International, and I had Zoe from Zoe's Fancy Cakes as my glamorous assistant, and she worked on the pom-pom while I did the rest. And when we did it like that, we actually managed to do the whole cake in an hour. So if you have somebody who can help you, even if it's just cutting out all the daisies for you or working on the pom-pom while you work on the rest, it does make life a lot easier. But yes, anyway, it's ridiculously late now. You don't even want to know what time it is, so I'm gonna wrap things up. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if you did enjoy this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up down below. If you'd like to see more videos like this from me here on Mr. Baker's Cakes, then make sure to hit that big red subscribe button. And if you'd like to receive a notification every time I upload a new video, you can also ring the bell. But yes, on that note, I'm going to go, and well, actually I'm not going to go to bed, I'm going to go and start editing this video, and I will see you all at the same time next week for another one. Until then, take care guys.